Rebellion have been brothers in arms and hitting the mark of their long-running Sniper Elite series since the Xbox and PlayStation 2. Now with the 5th release spanning Xbox One to PlayStation 5, do they still have victory in their sights? This World War II tale has evolved and improved within each release, but blowing off Nazi bonzes and balls is still as satisfying now as the 2005 debut. The X-ray Gull factor ramped this up in the V2 remake and remains one of the key features and technical improvements of their proprietary Asura engine the whole series runs on. There are significant improvements here over the 4th release, such as water rendering, which now uses tessellation on geometric bodies. Materials themselves have been significantly improved due to the team moving to a photogrammetry technique for all objects in the world. Terrain is improved with parallax occlusion maps and excellent use of textures and filtering and mip maps, even on the base Xbox One. It must actually be praised how good the high frequency details are in this game due to a combination of no TAA and a strong mipmap bias on textures, which increases clarity at the expense of a moire pattern at times on obvious oblique angles into the distance that I think pays off in the overall image quality. There has been some sharp cutbacks in some areas on last generation consoles, such as shadows and level of detail, but predominantly the improvements across the board hit every single version from Sniper Elite 4, and this includes things like deformation on character models and alpha effects. But it is not a surprise that the PS5, Series X and obviously PC are the best here. The team and engine have a long legacy, and this includes supporting APIs such as Mantle back in the day. The current rendering engine supports DX12 and Vulkan on PC. Not too sure which version on consoles is supported, but DX12 is obvious on Xbox. It may be Vulkan based on the PlayStation consoles. Some of the improvements here are things like obscurance fields, which was available in the previous release, and these are analytical lower polygon proxy meshes, a little similar to capsule proxies you see in other titles. These are effectively sampled per pixel if an object is occluded or occluding other objects around walls or itself, such as arms, legs, or against floors, and you see this predominantly on the main character only, specifically around feet contacting the floor and self-shadowing on the body and legs. It can be a nice improvement on character interaction within the world, but it isn't a huge impact to the quality of the title itself, and it's more obvious once you turn it off than when it's turned on. In addition to this, it also uses screen space ambient occlusion, which improves the contact areas of foliage, walls, characters, and again, it does help improve the solidity and depth of the world, but due to the low calculation of the depth and overall resolution, even on the PC's best, it can leave a very strong, thick silhouette around objects at certain times, giving a little bit of a Jet Set Radio look. The engine also supports adaptive tessellation, specifically silhouette based on models. The aim of this is to improve the character's quality by subdividing the meshes only on the outer extremities of each character model dynamically within the camera frustum as it moves, and it improves the quality of materials and objects as you can see on screen. Now this is only present on PS5 and it's not running on the Series X. Oddly, as you can see here, flicking back and forth, it looks like our characters hit the gym. But in actual fact, this might be a possible API signification, the fact that it's running Vulkan and therefore it's easier to implement, or it could actually be a bug because all PlayStation versions run this adaptive silhouette tessellation, but no Xbox console does. The increase in geometric detail is welcome, but it's not always as visible as what I'm showing here from these backs and forth, and it could also explain some of the differences we're seeing with the platform comparisons I'll get to in a minute. But the net result is on PlayStation consoles you get a far rounder head or eyeball as it's blown out of their face. So the engine has improved and they've certainly made a good stride forward in improving the modernization of the Asura engine. But what about those platform comparisons? Well, let's take the Series X, the PlayStation 5 and the Series S first and get into some pixel counts and performance. First up, the console count. So what we have here is a dynamic resolution solution. It does look to be using FSR 1.0, the same as the PC, to improve the sharpness or reconstruct that image back to a 4K target, but fundamentally it's dynamically scaling below that level. Both Series X and PlayStation 5 can target 3840 by 2160, but this only happens when you're staring at pretty much nothing at all on screen, basically looking skyward. Outside of that, you're predominantly somewhere around the 1800p level, but I did get lows as low as 2560 by 1440 on the Series X, and slightly lower on the PS5, 2304 by 1296 is as low as it went. In fact, this shot right here is exactly that comparison. 1440p versus 1296p. Not a huge difference, around 9% delta in resolution, but it certainly shows a contrast in image quality, and at certain points it's a little sharper on the Series X than it is on PS5, but you're not really going to notice it because, as I alluded to before, the stability of the image is always a factor due to the fact that it doesn't use any TAA. All of them, even a 4K image on PC, has a slight amount of shimmer. It is slightly softer on texture details and assets when zoomed in, but at normal playing distance on a 4K screen, all of these things disappear into the distance, but it is there for this technical comparison. In addition to this, we also see a delta in terms of performance, but before we get there, let's talk about the Series S version, which targets the same functions and features of its bigger siblings, but unfortunately resolution and performance take an impact. Here it probably targets a 2560 by 1440p highest point, but I never counted that. The highest I counted, even looking at the ceiling, was 2048 by 1152, and it can drop as low often to 1536 by 864. Again, with dynamic resolution scalings, there's always the caveat that it could go higher and lower, but these are the most often ranges that I caught, which means in play, the Series S is often 1080p or below it, and this stands up to scrutiny when you compare the two versions. The delta between this and the other next-gen consoles, or current generation, is very apparent, but it stands out more when compared to the Xbox One X and the PS4 Pro, which both support higher resolutions, albeit with a lower performance target. But again, the game is very fast in action, lots of motion blur, depth of field, and predominantly you wouldn't notice it, and every single version has that level of instability under movement, which means the Series S certainly doesn't look the best of the bunch, but it at least targets a higher performance output. Aside resolution though, all the effects parity remains, which means you get better shadow quality, level of detail, and that water tessellation on all versions. So IQ aside, it is still a pretty good port, but performance is another conversation. PlayStation 5 first, and it's a game of two halves. Just like the Series X, in open gameplay they are both pretty solid 60 FPS and hold closer to the higher levels of those resolutions. But in the X-ray kills or those real-time cinematics, then they can both dip into the lower 50s, with PS5 dipping more often. As you can see here, and the camera pans around and the internal organs explode, performance is affected. The more dense and geometry based they are, the heavier the impact. Likely bandwidth with all the alpha and dual meshes being the core reason, and fill rate sections with just heavy alpha, as you see here, can also cause both to dip pretty much equally. But the Series X can be unaffected at times in those X-rays, and then dip in others, just less so than the PlayStation 5, to the tune of around 8 to 10% at worst. As mentioned, resolution can also be lower on the PS5, but geometry is higher on the PS5, so it may also be a factor in these sections. Aside these largely passive areas though, both are locked 60 and feel smooth enough to play to never really offend. VRR can help on both because it stays just within that sweet spot, but it's not really that vital in my opinion, but you can use it if desired. Net results mean the Series X does perform slightly better and can have a small resolution increase as well, so if you have both consoles, the Series X just pips the PS5, but the delta is almost invisible aside this deep excavation. Series S is not so solid, sadly. The resolution still causes dips in all the same places as we see with the bigger consoles, but they are worse and more prolonged. But more impactful than this is gameplay is also affected, sometimes seeing it dip right down to 30 FPS. This isn't to say that it consistently dips. It can have smoother areas when you're running around or exploring, certainly in interiors without any major issues, but generally it feels inconsistent to play and it's well outside of that VRR range. Because the resolution drops much lower, I do suspect that some decreases in the level of detail and other aspects of the title itself may actually claw some of this performance deficit back, because it is predominantly GPU limited. So it's sadly to say that this is not a game that performs anywhere near a locked 60 FPS, both in gameplay and those X-ray kills. Generally, if it's dipping on the PS5 and Series X, it's dipping more on the Series S. It's far from a bad title, and it doesn't feel terrible to play, but it is a shame that a new generation console can't perform a title like this at a higher resolution and a better performance rate than its older siblings in the Xbox One X and the PS4 Pro. Well, not all the time anyway. The last generation versions unsurprisingly come in with lower levels of resolution, or at least in the Xbox One and the PS4. Surprisingly here, they are pretty close. Both of them probably target high resolutions than I'm getting here. So the PS4's high point was 1680 by 945, again looking upwards, and it drops as low as 1280 by 720. The Xbox One S, the highest I caught was 1440 by 810, and that drops as low as 1200 by 675. So there's around 15% delta between the two consoles, but that's actually quite a small difference to what we're used to on the PS4 and Xbox One S. The teams certainly have utilised their DirectX skills here to get the best out of the Xbox One S. I'm quite impressed with the results. They probably target high resolutions in the Xbox One S, probably 900p, PS4 1080p. I just never caught a point where it was that high. Moving into the premium versions of last generation though, there is a significant improvement. The Xbox One X unsurprisingly comes out on top, which can target a full 3840 by 2160 just like the big boys, but it can also drop as low as 2560 by 1440, and it is predominantly around that level in most action sections, but it is a very sharp and clean image compared to the Series S, as I alluded to earlier, and even sharper than the PS4 Pro, which can top out where the PS5 bottoms out at 2304 by 1296. Again though, that can drop as low as 1920 by 1080, with the caveat that dynamic resolution scalings can always target other areas. It probably targets 1440p, but I never caught any point where it hit it, which means you get a softer, slightly muddier image on the Pro compared to the Xbox One X, and obviously softer compared to the Series X and the PS5. But these two consoles do offer the closest image quality to the premium consoles of this generation, and that means that the Series S comes behind both of them, which is a shame, and it does stand out at certain points, specifically in those replay sections which impact the GPU very heavily. Overall, the image quality between the last generation and new generation is very close. The biggest deltas I saw is level of detail, with the foliage levels and some of the other areas such as shadows looking to be on low and medium on the PS4 and the Xbox One, and then on the Pro and Xbox One X, they both target the same levels of high or some ultra on the Series X and PS5. They're very close, but shadows and level of detail, as you can see on screen, are the biggest differences between last generation and now generation. It's close to the PC's best across the board, and this means things like that water tessellation, the deformation on characters, the bokeh shapes in the depth of field, the per object motion blur and camera and radial blur that happens throughout the title. All of that is carried over to every single format, meaning you don't miss out pretty much if you play it on the Xbox One all the way up to the PS5 or Series X. But performance is another conversation, and these last generation consoles, none of them target 60 FPS. That is exclusive to the Series S, the Series X and the PS5, and obviously PC, which can go over and above depending on your hardware. This means that performance sticks to a level of 30 more often than not, but once we get into GPU heavy sections, again, the same conversation we've had before, all of the same issues arise, and it can now drop down to the low 20s. Some of this might again be related to that geometry increase on the PlayStation consoles, which perform significantly worse than the Xbox One even at times. So this does lead me to believe that the performance issues are a combination of those geometry areas I mentioned before, causing some of the performance hiccups at these points on both the PS4 and the Pro, but also the API issue and memory bound issues we see with that double buffered flat 20 FPS cropping up at certain points on both PS4 titles. And the disparity between the Xbox and PS4 platforms does seem slightly larger than the expectation we've seen throughout the generation. I'm pretty sure there'll be improvements on this title over the coming weeks and months ahead, and there were a few issues I noted which I'll cover at the end of the review. The conversation around the Xbox One X and the PS4 Pro is pretty similar. Predominantly the Xbox One X has a high resolution, it performs better overall, and all the last generation consoles hit the 30 FPS target more often. They can both dip in certain X-ray sections and certain cinematics, but if it's going to dip, it's going to dip more on the PS4 Pro than the Xbox One X, and generally performance is pretty rock solid on the One X. In fact, if you have a 4K screen, I'd actually recommend the Xbox One X version over the Series S. It's more consistent and has better image quality overall. Yes, the Series S can hit 60 FPS, but it feels less consistent to play, and on a 4K screen, it certainly is not as impressive looking as the Xbox One X is.
Got to get past these Nazis and get inside.
As an update, it is certainly a much better release than 4. From world activity in dynamic vegetation, smoke and alpha effects, excellent water physics and SSR reflections, and the photogrammetry moves from the team with the abundant light sources that the engine offers thanks to it being a deferred base renderer, greatly increases the solidity and the accuracy of all materials with excellent light attenuation and reflectance. The asset improvements also aid the IQ. Now, aside specular highlights on dark contrasting scenes, there being the obvious blight on stability under temporal motion, it is a better choice not using TAA with the age of the engine and all the other constraints around it than sticking TAA on top, which I think would soften the overall image and IQ here, and it certainly improved the Xbox One with a lower resolution base. Even though it looks quite unstable at times, it certainly doesn't have that soft, muddy look that a lot of modern engines and TAA based engines do nowadays. It takes advantage of the new generation of consoles in terms of the SSD, the I/O and compression techniques by being 3 to 4 times faster than the fastest of the last generation consoles, all within a hair's breadth of each other. The last generations are pretty fast, with the PS4 Pro powered with an SSD edging sub 20 seconds, which shows that it is bandwidth limited at certain points, but it does take advantage of the compression block at some level on both Series X, Series S and PlayStation 5. But obviously the X-ray shots hit and hit hard as the biggest technical leap in the title itself. Eyes, brains, hearts and lungs and more are all Mortal Kombat-ified, and they've added more alpha effects here, which, although great as skull and claret debris flies through the air in slow motion, it can also hide some of the deformation of the skull and geometry underneath. It certainly looks less visceral than 4 could at times, which might be an obvious stance by the team, and it's clearly been improved in many areas, but I'm sure, like me, you'll find certain aspects of 4 better here. The dynamic nature of these moments are a clear example of technology improving gameplay. Even from handguns, explosions and more, it really enhances the tense and satisfying moments as you take out the enemy from near or afar. But the game does have a collection of issues I had throughout my playthrough. I got stuck on a PS5 mission and couldn't get the key, so I had to reset the whole first mission and play it again because it wouldn't let me pick up the key even though I had. Lots of points where the enemy would be shot and then continue with their animation routine before then dying, and even getting stuck in T-poses and other areas across the title. So there is definitely issues across every single version that certainly need to be addressed, and there's already been 4 patches. This is patch 104 that I've tested here. But as is par for the course in this modern age, I'm sure many patches will come to improve these areas and others that I haven't covered, and close that delta up between the Xbox and PlayStation platforms, which I think is a little wider than you would normally expect. Overall, Sniper Elite 5 is a beautiful update to Sniper Elite 4. It doesn't change the game significantly, and it hasn't improved everything to a level that makes it transformative, but It does take the Asura engine and add a lot of modern features into it, and I think the integration of FSR 1.0 is actually a testament of how quick you can implement a solution such as that, and that's exactly why it needs to exist. But that's another performance review done. Remember to keep your IGN for much more like this. Meanwhile, I'm off to take out more Nazis who aren't the smartest fellas on the battlefield. I'll catch you on the next one.